Thank you so much. That is a tough act to follow. The entire morning, I think, is a tough act to follow, and I think it's just gotten better and better throughout the day. We're just so grateful to have all of you here with us. It's really remarkable that we are in our 4th year of this annual SIF Convening. My name is Kate Dempsey. I'm with the Center for Economic Opportunity. I am the budget director for CEO. I've also been working very closely with the Jobs Plus program since we started it at one site in East Harlem in 2009. And then I also work directly with the SIF team and have been working with all of the SIF initiatives for a couple of years now. And so I'm honored to moderate this next panel. When we were talking about how to think about the agenda for this conference, we certainly, as we think about every year, don't want to repeat any of the themes that we've covered extensively in prior convenings. We want to recognize where we are in our implementation of the grant. And so in the first year, it was all about, what are we going to do? How are we even going to get this started? And then it was sort of about, okay, have we gotten anything done in the first year in terms of implementation that we thought we would? We were happy to say yes. And now we are really at the stage where it's appropriate and necessary for us to think about where these programs are going. So that's really sort of what the progression of this day's conversation is intended to be about. We started the day by talking about what the problems are and recognizing that the problems that we are trying to solve are problems at scale. And then we sort of dove back down to ground level, talking about where all of our programs currently are and the populations that they're serving and the progress that they've made in their communities over these years. And so now we are here to think more about where these programs are all going. And I think before we get too far ahead, I just want to take a second to recognize this really beautiful space that we're all in. Again, this is the 4th year of our convening. We were in Manhattan for 2 years, DC last year, and now we are at the Brooklyn Law School. So I just want to thank Sinead and Patrick and Emily, our SIF team, for everything they've done to make this such an organized and fun conference so far in this beautiful space. Let's give them an applause. And I want to thank our host, the Brooklyn Law School. Frankly, we were looking around the city trying to find cool spaces to bring everybody together, and I think we really found it in the Brooklyn Law School. But in giving it a little bit more thought, I was also kind of realizing there's, especially too after the talk we just heard, there's a wonderful connection to be made. You know, thinking about law, thinking about justice, thinking about the symbol of the justice system being a scale, and thinking about all of our goal of bringing that scale into balance. And oddly enough, there is then this sort of literal connection to the theme that we're all talking about today. And in sort of thinking about, yes, there are just different definitions of the same word, but frankly, it really is all kind of coming at a common goal and a common theme. And the kind of scale that we're talking about, I think one thing that's going to be interesting for us to discuss is what are the different definitions of serving populations at scale or operating a program at scale. Even that in itself has a number of different ways you can come at it. But in thinking about scale as justice, I think we are talking about scale in a sense that means proportional. And so you're talking about scale being a solution or a service or a response that is proportional to the goal you're trying to accomplish or the population that you're trying to serve. And so with that very profound connection I was able to draw between our beautiful space and the group we've got in front of us, I am quite honored to introduce our panelists who have really done us a great honor by being here with us today to talk about the work that they've taken on in this area. So I'll give a quick introduction of all of our panelists. Then we talked about having each of them open with talking about a way that they are taking on this work in this area, what they're doing now or have done in the past to approach taking a program to scale. And I think in each of their experiences that sort of has a different perspective. And then we'll talk a little bit more going through some of the moderated questions that we've already begun discussing among ourselves. And so immediately to my right, I am quite honored to introduce Deputy Mayor Richard Bury. He is the Deputy Mayor for Strategic Policy Initiatives in the New York City Office of the Mayor. In his role, he is focusing on implementing some of the new administration's highest priority and most ambitious policy initiatives, including Mayor de Blasio's signature Universal Pre-K program. Prior to his appointment, he was the president and CEO of Children's Aid Society, so he has been a partner of ours for quite some time. Next, we've got Katie Galsteeg, who is the Executive Director of the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development. In this role, she is leading the task of overhauling New York's workforce development programs. Prior to this, she was Deputy Commissioner of Employment and Contracts at the New York City Human Resources Administration, where she oversaw back to work and subsidized jobs and the expansion of our Jobs Plus program, another partner. Next, we've got Stephen Lee. He's the Managing Director for Income Security at the Robin Hood Foundation. Starting to see a theme here of friends of ours that we keep close to ourselves wherever they go. As Managing Director, he oversees $25 million in grants in the areas of microlending, legal counseling, financial services, access to benefits, workforce development, and social venture financing. Finally, all the way to the right, we've got John Martinez. He is the Deputy Director of Program Development at MDRC. He has been with MDRC since 1997. I think MDRC counts among another friends of ours. I've heard their name before in this crowd. He's an expert in project incubation and startup. Prior to taking on the role that he's currently in, he was Deputy Director of MDRC's Health and Barriers to Employment Policy area, where he focused predominantly on projects targeting young people, including youth with disabilities, and those in the foster care and juvenile justice systems. So we have assembled quite a panel of experts, and I'm excited to hear what they have to say. So I think to kick this off, what we'd like to do is just hear from each of you how you have approached or are approaching a program being implemented at scale and what your goals for that work are. Deputy Mayor Bury?
Sure. Good afternoon, and thank you for the introduction. Really happy to be here. Can you all hear me? So very happy to be here. I do feel like I have a long history with the Center for Economic Opportunity, including going back, I guess, 3 jobs from Groundwork, which is an organization that I led and which participated in the original implementation of a conditional cash transfer program to the Children's Aid Society, and now at the Mayor's Office. And the new leader of CEO, Matt Klein, in the back, is we go way back, one of my oldest friends and certainly an amazing leader. So I'm very happy to be here. Believe very much in the mission of CEO, and glad that I have the opportunity now in my new job to continue to partner with CEO. I'm also very glad that I missed Angela Glover Blackwell, because then I don't have to be intimidated by following her immediately and speaking. So I planned that timing excellently. So I'll be very brief because I know we have a little bit of time and want to talk. As Kate said, I'm one of 4 deputy mayors, and I have an interesting job among the deputy mayors, which is to help lead a series of mayoral initiatives that don't necessarily fit neatly into one part of city government, but that involve organizing different aspects of city government to achieve really big goals. The most spoken about of which is expansion of universal pre-kindergarten. Over the course of 2 years, we are going from a system where there are 20,000 4-year-olds in full-day pre-kindergarten to 73,000 4-year-olds in full-day pre-kindergarten. Another large initiative is the growth of our after-school programs, where we are adding this fall additional 40,000 children who will be in after-school programs in middle schools around the city, a number that will also grow in the second year. So our mayor does not believe in small targets. He believes in big targets. And it really goes to, for him, a question of justice. He was elected on a platform of One New York Rising Together. He spoke very eloquently during his campaign about our city and the lack of opportunity in our city, the fact that this city has always been 2 cities, one of opportunity and one denied opportunity, and that in his time in office, he wanted to take big steps in addressing the problem of opportunity and would look at big transformational initiatives that would move the needle in significant ways. And based on the compelling evidence that exists around the value that quality pre-kindergarten programs play, not only in supporting educational achievement, but reducing the achievement gap and bringing economic opportunity not only to the children who benefit to their parents, really identified pre-kindergarten not only as a substantive benefit to the city, but also what it would mean to have that be the first thing that the mayor would take on. that not only was it substantively important, but also symbolically important to have this be his first initiative and to address it in such a large way. So the first thing that is a critical element of scale in this way is finding the money for an initiative like this. And so the first success was our grassroots effort to win $300 million a year from Albany to implement the program. And I can't believe I'm saying this now, but that turned out to be the easiest part of this initiative. Now we're in the much more complex work of organizing an entire city government, coordinating the work of over a dozen city agencies with different cultures, different goals, to operate singularly to impact this change. And so I think what I will just say before passing the mic is that scale for us in the city obviously is very different than scale at the Children's Aid Society, which was very different from scale at Groundwork, which is a small nonprofit that I led before the Children's Aid Society. But the primary factor that I think determines our success in city government is our ability to get the machinery of city government working together, because it's a 300,000 person organization, and there's very little you can accomplish with an organization of that size and with that talent. The difference, I think, under this administration is what happens when a mayor clearly articulates to everyone that this is the most important thing. And I think what I'm experiencing is how you actually can achieve scale at quality with relative speed when you have clearly established a priority and really put the resources, not just financial, but human capital resources, into making sure that every part of city government puts it at the first of its mission. So looking forward to a great dialogue, and we'll pass it along to the next panelist.
I guess that's me. So first of all, I want to thank CEO for hosting this, and it really is our pleasure and honor to be part of this. So let me start off by saying I think Robin Hood, to many degrees, is the antithesis of scale. And I'm going to explain that in a little bit. But let me tell you sort of what we're doing on some scalable efforts, and then I'll try to answer that question or comment I just posed. So we're involved in probably, I think, 3 scalable type endeavors, maybe 4. The first, we're involved in a social innovation fund initiative called Pathways, which some of you may know, which is around access or to help students stay in college. The second, we're involved in the social impact bond with CEO and social finance, all around ex-offenders, getting them jobs, and so forth. And then there are 2 which I would consider scale, but were nurtured within Robin Hood. One is an early childhood initiative, where we're working with our folks from MDRC to think about how do we help young boys and girls with math, of all things, as a means to help them actually graduate from high school. And I can explain that, but I'll just leave it at that. And the last thing is we're working on a prize, of all things, around an app to help kids stay in college. So let me get back to my first comment about Robin Hood being the antithesis of scale. My opinion on scale, of mostly what I see, is that scale is often based on outputs rather than outcomes. And so when I say outputs, what the universe loves and what the government loves is when someone says, or when there's a front page article in the Times that says, we have helped thousands, tens of thousands of poor people. But the reality is that many of those poor people may have gotten that help anyway, right? So that is an output. So what we care about as much as we can is an outcome, right? That is how many of them wouldn't have gotten that output but for the intervention. And when you look at it from that lens, very rarely do you think about thousands, tens of thousands, right? You think about hundreds. For us, that's success. So when I talk about the early childhood initiative and the prize, the goal for that is not to serve tens of thousands. It's to serve hundreds to some degree. And then if you can get a model that works, that Head Start can adopt, then you get to millions. So you go from hundreds to millions in a way that has proven to work, as opposed to chasing the money and trying to get tens of thousands when, to some degree, you may not know that it works. So I think Robin Hood is largely about, as much as we can, piloting something in a rigorous way, and showing the world that actually is based on outcomes, and then telling people, hey, listen, this stuff kind of works. Maybe Head Start should get involved, right? Maybe community colleges across the country should get involved. Then you get to millions. So that's sort of the way Robinhood thinks about scale, which is, I think, maybe a little different than somehow others think about scale. And I'll stop at that.
I also want to say thank you for having me here. It's a real honor to be speaking with so many friends and colleagues and learning so much at a conference like this. So when we think about scale, one of the questions I wanted to talk about was scale versus or scale and system change. So a lot about what the two panelists have already spoken about. And one of the things to me is that scale is programs that fit inside of a system. And that, so we might want to try to reach more sites or more individuals. However, what ends up happening is that those scales need continued new funding streams or new grants, whereas that system change could be building into current funding streams changes that would be inherent and therefore have kind of large-scale impacts. One of the things that I've seen, I think we were supposed to talk about maybe a little bit about our past, in Jobs Plus, one of the most amazing things that I saw was here we are scaling up this program where we see more and more sites become a part of it. But then we also see, by having more and more sites, we see some systems change. So through the EID, or the Earned Income Disallowance, by teaching more of our NYCHA staff here in our public housing in New York City about how to use and how to process correctly the Earned Income Disallowance for Jobs Plus as a program, we are able to affect systems change. In fact, one of the things we look at are not only the number of people who are Jobs Plus members who are now getting this Earned Income Disallowance, meaning that they can start working, but that their rent does not go up that first month. They get a chance to acclimate to work, to get the supports for work before their rent goes up. So we not only look at those that are in Jobs Plus that were able to take benefit from the Earned Income Disallowance, but we look at everyone in that whole complex that also gets the Earned Income Disallowance. So that's not just the impact of scale. You can see that means the workers, that you can see the impact of systems change. So that's the kind of the meeting of, I think, scales and system change that we're really going for. I love this stuff, so I went right to what I wanted to talk about, but I also want to say that in my new role in the Office of Workforce Development, I couldn't have possibly articulated it more clearly than Deputy Mayor did. So we've got a very similar mission to both scale and do system change and break, I always say hashtag break it down. We got to break it down, and we've got to build up something that's really going to help the city, come together, one city rising, and really help workforce development in all of the different agencies. So that is my new challenge, and I'll speak more about it as the questions come. So.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Since my three esteemed colleagues said thank you, I guess it would be rude for me not to do the same. So thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it. At MDRC, I work with the other Social Innovation Fund grantee, Edna McConnell Clark, where we're tackling similar issues around scale. But I thought it would be interesting to focus on a different project that MDRC was involved in, because I think it really speaks to the agony and the ecstasy of trying to scale a program. And that's the Career Academies model. And I don't know if folks are familiar with Career Academies, but essentially they're small schools within schools. Kids have opportunities to take on academics and also career exploration opportunities through partnering with local employers. So Career Academies started out in a few sites around the country. Over 40 years ago, it started in Philly. The current model that really combines this idea of some post-secondary education pieces really emerged in the 80s, but it's been around a long time. MDRC engaged in a random assignment study of this particular model, started it in the early 90s. And the results of this evaluation, we've seen some of the largest impacts on employment in almost any program that we've ever evaluated. And I think partly because of those results, we've seen career academies being replicated all across the country. I think the last time I looked, there was something like 7,000 career academies operating around the country. When you think about having started out in a few places, now we're at 7,000. That speaks to the power of being able to kind of scale and replicate a model. But with that, over the course of this history, we've also seen some real significant challenges to that scale. So across these 7,000, you've seen variations in the model, some of which look very, very different from the models that were actually evaluated by MDRC. So now you're seeing this swing back to how do we make sure we're implementing those core models. There's been investments in at the federal level to make sure they're developing rigorous curriculums and things like that. But I think it's a really interesting story to think about when you start scaling something and you have that success and the being able to point to look how many kids we're serving through this model, but also the real challenges around making sure that what you're scaling is the program that was determined to be effective. And we'll talk about that more in a few minutes, but I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you very much. I'd actually, therefore, like to take a point of Steve's and a point of John's and post them to Rich and to Katie, because I think in talking about the work that each of you is doing, there's an opportunity to talk about, how at a certain point we just realistically need to talk about a certain number of outputs just to be able to communicate the scale of what we're doing and how we're going about making sure we get there. And then likewise, you have a proven model, and at 3 sites, that model is never mind, it's not extremely easy to implement and manage and make sure you do well, but it looks easy when you try to think about offering it to millions. So let's start with pre-K. As you are trying to expand pre-K, make it universal, how do you think about what are the most important program elements to maintain tight control over? How do you institute that control? And how do you accept the reality that some things are not able to be as closely controlled, and how do you manage that dynamic?
That's a great question. So I think a few thoughts. One is building on what Steve Lee said. I think the classic, the ideal partnership between the private sector and the public sector would be that the private sector engages in innovation and the public sector then adopts and scales innovation that have been proven through research. And what's so interesting about CEO generally is the idea that more innovation could be taken into government. I think one of the challenges of that classic model is that there is no system or organization, and government is no different, that is driven entirely by evidence. So the fact that you have evidence for a particular model, a particular approach, is not by itself a guarantee of your ability to implement according to that evidence or to scale those things that have evidence. And if you look at the money that we spend generally on social services as a country, there's a relatively small percentage of that you could make a strong argument is actually supported by broad evidence. And so in the case of pre-kindergarten, I think the fundamental premise of pre-kindergarten and expanding it was driven by evidence of the importance that a high-quality pre-kindergarten system could deliver. Much of that evidence is driven by much smaller and controlled initiatives. And even if you look at sort of other cities like Boston, which have had some significant success in scaling pre-kindergarten, the scale the comparison between what Boston has done and what New York City is trying to do it's not comparable. The scale of what we're trying to do is much broader. So I think in that regard, we as a government are sort of balancing different things. I mean, we care about outcomes, but we also frankly care about outputs. And I think part of our job is to deliver a safe, reliable service to families, while at the same time making sure that service is more and more driving high-quality results for children. I think at the same time we're realistic enough to know that the process of building a system which is consistently driving high-quality outcomes throughout the system over time, particularly given the fundamentals of our system here in New York City, is not something that will happen overnight or in the first year, even in the best implementation of this program. It is, I think, really a marathon, not a sprint, and part of our work is to continue to build a stronger system over time. And one of our challenges is that we're building, we are not starting from scratch. We're building on top of an existing system, a system which has lots of strengths but has lots of challenges, a system which relies on lots of different organizations to deliver services. And so trying to build a consistent model of quality and to invest in the oversight of that quality and to invest in evaluation is a significant undertaking. So I think for us, we sort of take a long-term view. We're committed to quality. We're committed to making sure that every program that we open is high quality and safe. But we also understand that actually building that at this scale, inevitably by trying to have a program at this scale, we're assuming more growing pain than you would have for a smaller program. And so I think we understand that and accept that as we move forward.
And Katie, maybe to continue on that track, with your experience expanding Jobs Plus, and we can talk a little bit more about what it would mean to offer Jobs Plus at scale, but certainly exponentially expanding it by taking it from 2 sites to 9 in New York City. How did you think about what to maintain tight control over? I think as most people in the room know, Jobs Plus has 3 very specific components of the model, but much of what you focused on was about things that are not in those 3 components, but there were elements of implementation that ended up being really critical to making sure quality was controlled and things stayed on track. So how do you manage all of that?
Well, you have a very good team, most of whom are here, thankfully, including Kate Dempsey. And that is actually the honest answer. I mean, what you do, though, and scale, when you're taking, we had a SIF grantee in Bronx Works, just to explain, and we had one city-funded Jobs Plus site, and then we wanted to expand those to a total of 9. So one of the big lessons about scale, I think, and one of the things that was successful was that we were able to realize that everyone was not going to have the capacity. All the organizations were not going to know how to do this right away, and we really learned some of that through the first 2 sites. And so we really created a lot of technical, what we call, technical assistance, which is not a very nice, it doesn't really tell you what that is, right? Technical assistance. But what that means is that you really try to help empower the specific, folks that are going to be on the ground delivering the services and the organizations on how they can ramp up as quickly as possible. And so that means everyone from CEO doing a great job with their leadership academy that our folks got to be a part of, as well as making sure that we were really clearly defining the metrics and defining the terms, which was a really big important step, as well as something as using the same data and using the same database. And our staff would certainly tell you that that was not easy, but we ended up replicating one of the data systems for the scale. And if we had not done that, we probably still would not be at scale. We would still be struggling. If we had told everyone, hey, invent your own data system, build it yourself, figure out how to do it within this $1.1 million budget, I can tell you right now that we would not be as successful, and that some organizations would still really be struggling with some of that. So that is actually technical assistance. It is making sure that people had the tools to succeed. And so I would say that scale is really about that. And I think Deputy Mayor Bury was just talking about that as well. I mean, in order to make sure kids are safe and that the teachers know what the curriculum and that the facilities are there, those are the key components to really making sure you go to scale. So you can't just take a great idea and make sure that everyone tries to figure it out without supporting them and making sure that those principles are there. So I would say that's some of the lessons I learned about taking this to scale.
Great, thanks, John.
I just wanted to, digging into this question of thinking about, you have a model with all these components, and so what are you going to, think about scaling? And I just wanted to give a shout out. Is Mike Bangser? Yeah, Mike Bangser is here. So Mike Bangser from MDRC, I think wrote a terrific paper, and it's basically a funder's guide for scaling. And one of the things that he really focuses on is this specific issue. How do you think about what elements of a particular program to scale when you're trying to invest in it? And going back to something Stephen said, I mean, obviously the ideal is you keep evaluating and making sure that you're still getting the results that you want to. But I think the paper does a nice job of kind of highlighting some other things that you can do. Things like looking at the theory of change of the particular model. What are the key elements that you thought were going to make a difference? And then look at how they were implemented. And if there's a piece that wasn't implemented very well, it probably wasn't a factor in terms of making a difference for the participants. Looking at findings from focus groups, from surveys, interviews with both the program staff and the participants. They can often tell you what parts of the program really made a difference for them, and those might be the things that you want to focus in on. And I think the last thing I would say is something that Gordon spoke about this morning, and this idea when you have programs that are operating in multiple places, sometimes you can find those programs that are really implemented well and use those as the examples for what pieces of a particular program you want to implement. So looking at the outcomes across programs and the ones that are doing a really, really good job, trying to get inside and understand what is it about what they're doing that is really making a difference, and then those are the pieces that you want to replicate.
Katie?
Please.
I just want to comment on something that the Deputy Mayor said, and he's exactly right. Right? The realities of the world are exactly as Richard described. Right? You get a pot of money, and you got to do something with it. You have no choice. You just got to do it. But what happens, the upshot of that is, as you do it, it gets very difficult to evaluate what the heck's going on. You got multiple parties with multiple agendas and so forth, and you still got to run the programs. And to figure out how all this stuff works in a way that's reasonably intelligent is really difficult. But that is the way of the world, so I get it. It's obviously easier if you can do something with a pilot and be really rigorous about it and then see if you can get that to scale. But Richard's exactly right. The world we live in is not that. We as a funder have the ability to do that. But the reality is that doesn't happen that often. I would just urge, as you think about how do you do it, that the evaluation piece, and everyone here knows that, is really important, but it's really hard. Like once you start running a program, right, and you got to spend the money, you got to meet the demands, you got to worry about the press and all that kind of stuff, right, which the deputy, it's hard. So I would just urge all of us to think about the difficulty, but the importance, right, of really trying to figure out like what is it that we're really trying to achieve.
Great. So to that point, I think most of the folks in this room are leaders from programs that are implementing 5 program models at 16 sites in 8 cities. So we have the folks with us who are doing the work and have been doing the work since 2010. I think and hope that they know that we are not expecting them to drive the expansion to scale or the dissemination of the findings or necessarily lead the way without all of our support in communicating what is learned and thinking about how we take it to the next level. I think we've all agreed in this network that we have that it's a collective effort and each of us plays a role in that. That said, as these sites are in entering year 4 of a 5-year initiative, and they are thinking about where these programs go next with us, I think it's interesting to think about the various drivers of scale, and they're varied and they come from different places. And so we all agree that the biggest driver is money. And if there is money and money shows up and the people with the money want to spend it on the thing you're doing, then you're in great shape. But I think we all agree that it's not just the money, and even in where there is the money, it shouldn't go towards what we're doing unless we have the evidence. So we've also got this idea that the evidence is a huge driver and should really be the driver behind figuring out where these programs are supposed to go. But if you've got money and you've got evidence, sometimes it doesn't always necessarily come together even when you think it should. Because then you've got these other sort of climate and environmental and political factors that very much shape how programs are going to be developed and how policy is going to be implemented. So I think if we could talk a little bit about the specific initiatives you mentioned, or just a little bit more broadly, what are some of the drivers behind how a program gets either scaled and taken to the next level or gets implemented at scale, and what, from a program provider's point of view, they should be thinking about and focusing on as they're now in year 4 of their program? What of the sort of domain that is within their control should they be paying particular attention to so that they are prepared to meet any of those drivers should they come their way?
I guess I can start. You know, I'm from MDRC, so I think evidence matters. So I'm just going to get that out there. But you know, one of the things that I've seen in a lot of the programs that I've worked with that I've seen being able to scale, it's really doing a good job of being able to combine the evidence with the compelling stories, really being able to talk about the difference your program is making. So getting the point across that you know what difference your program is making, being able to speak to what the evidence says, but then grounding that in specific examples of participants where it really kind of tells that compelling story about how that program is making a difference. And I think that makes a big difference. And it's, you know, I heard a lot of folks talk about it this morning around the importance. I think Mindy mentioned it, and Lourdes, I think you mentioned it. You gave an example of that, being able to speak very specifically about a participant's experience. And I think those compelling stories combined with the evidence really are what resonate with folks as they think about particular programs.
I'm going to echo what John said. And the experience that we've had on the SIF with the Pathways funds, which are for helping young men and women stay in college, the message is really important, but it's hard to craft because we have 6 different partners, again, all with a different type of agenda, and getting consensus on a simple message is hard. But the other hard problem is that it's a very crowded space. Everyone in the world wants to help young men and women stay in college. And so how do you differentiate your message and what you're doing relative to what the entire world is doing? Because that's where a lot of money is going in, right? And so it's really hard to figure out how am I better or how are we better and how do you message that better relative to everyone else that's doing roughly the exact same thing. Because if you can't message it, and we've had a hard time messaging it, you ain't going to get money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the message and how to tweak it among multiple parties and agendas is really difficult, but probably the most important thing.
Well, I agree with all that. I mean, what I might add is, from our perspective, as we think about pre-kindergarten, after-school expansion, some of these other initiatives, it's been very important to us to be very clear about what are the risks to the program. And in a lot of ways, our planning is driven by risk mitigation strategies. So we think very much about what are the things that can go wrong that can make the program less than successful, and we organize much of our work around that, which sounds very negative and depressing as I describe it. But I think it's been very important in terms of causing us to be, helping us to be driven by the right level of urgency, the right level of intensity, by always being focused on mitigating the risks of what could go wrong. And so I think at any sort of large-scale implementation, I found that to be a very helpful framework to organize our work.
That's a good point. And on that, you know, I think to look at that pretty much looks at the other side of the coin, which are what are the factors that can constrict an expansion or taking a program to scale. So, you know, I think implementation pitfalls or political barriers, are there any others that you've seen in your work as you're taking things like this on?
I mean, I think it's all the things you would expect. I mean, it is talent. So again, I'm going to use the prism of universal pre-kindergarten. So we have to identify 1,000 highly qualified early childhood educators by September. As I say these things out loud, I get very confused. So, you know, we think about talent, and I'm sure that's true for everything that everybody in this room is doing. It is much easier to do something in a quality way when you only have to hire 5 people than if you have to hire 1,000. So I think about talent. I think about capacity. I know that different organizations have different implementation strategies. For us, we were relying very greatly on a set of community-based early childhood centers around the city, all of whom have varying levels of capacity and sophistication. So we need to think about the capacity that exists in New York City. That is a real constraint to our ability to grow at quality, and so we're very focused on how do you find that capacity and how do you support it, and very much in encouraging high capacity organizations to do as much as they can in reason. In the case of pre-kindergarten, very much a question of facilities, so just the physical plan of New York City is a very serious obstacle. As I was mentioning before, our program is built on existing infrastructure. An existing infrastructure around how you enroll kids, how you process contracts. Just to give 2 examples, and there are a dozen of them, none of those were designed with what we're doing now in mind, and we didn't rebuild all of that and wait until that was all perfect to start working. We're building in some ways on a system that was not designed for it, so we're sort of building the road while I don't know what the right metaphor is, building the road while we build the car or something, or drive the car. But that's a constraint, and particularly one of speed. Do you need to sort of start from scratch in designing your infrastructure, or do you believe the infrastructure can sustain what you're trying to build, and then go back and refix the infrastructure after the fact, or improve it after the fact? And then there are all sorts of risks for us, or constraints around just sort of communications and community awareness. How do you communicate to a large number of people and institutions what you're doing? How do we communicate to parents why pre-kindergarten is important, why we would invest all these resources in it, why you should trust your child, whether it be at a school or a small center, why you should trust your child there, how do you enroll? And how do you communicate that, particularly when you're doing much of your communication through the prism of New York City's amazing tabloid press, which always did a wonderful job of communicating things accurately and fairly. How do you, thank you for appreciating attempted humor. So I think there are lots of constraints, and I think the constraints are going to be different in what you're doing, but I do think, I think I'm just repeating myself, I think what's most important is just to spend the time to identify what those constraints and challenges are. Because only if you have, with a real cold eye, identified everything that can go wrong and all the challenges you face, do you have a chance of actually overcoming those challenges.
The only thing I'd say, like, when we started getting on the SIF, the obvious constraints were around money and talent, that kind of stuff. Everyone knew that going in. The one thing that I think the groups didn't understand was the sort of the systems play, right? As Richard said, the infrastructure. And a lot of it sort of breaks down when you got to get data, report data, figure out data, give data to the right people, the right fund, all that kind of stuff, right? And some of the partners we've had haven't had the backbone, right, to absorb, analyze, figure out, get data to the right people at the right place at the right time. And those sort of systems plays, I think it's very mundane, but it's really important because those systems, nothing's going to happen. So I think that's the thing that was unanticipated, but it's really, really important.
I would just add that one of the constraints to, scale or large-scale systems change that, the Office of Workforce Development that we are grappling with is, of course, everyone who's a partner and who's a party to your, program is that they all want and they need to continue to get the kind of credit or the kind of outcomes that they're used to getting. And so if you want to create this scale or system change, you really do have to spend the groundwork of building that the outcomes or the outputs that you're looking at, that everyone's agreed to them and that everyone is really going to buy into them. And therefore, for example, if we want to, in New York City, really start talking about quality jobs, which might be around higher wage jobs or full-time jobs versus part-time jobs, then we're going to need to really reframe the way we think about our outcomes. And that's going to take a while. That's not going to be an easy fix. That's going to be constrained. So in a room, you can say that we really want to do these things. We really want to make these scalable changes. We know this is going to have a big impact, but I think it's really to what we've heard today in many of the speakers is that you have to have this community buy-in, and you have to really make sure that you're continuing to do that throughout the process, even maybe in your third or fourth year, that everyone's still committed to those unified outcomes.
So I think I'll just focus on one piece, and we talked about it, but I wanted to talk about it a slightly different way, and that's the funding issue and the money issue. And I think there's a couple of different things that come into play here. And one is often when you've developed a program and it's doing great things, and you kind of figure out what the cost per participant cost is, that can be daunting for systems to kind of adopt. What do you mean it costs X dollars per participant to do this? We can't do this. And so you start coming into these struggles around, well, what pieces are we going to drop, and how can we make this more palatable to be adopted at a wide scale? But I think what often happens is that things that are really important, like investing in performance management and making sure you're still achieving the outcomes that you're achieving and collecting the data you need to collect and having a robust MIS, can go by the wayside in the attempt to try and make a program more palatable and a little bit cheaper per complete. So it's trying to figure out a way to kind of make sure that performance management piece isn't lost in an attempt to make the cost per participant a little bit cheaper. And the last thing I'll say about this is I think that's where making sure that you have some kind of ROI or benefit cost analysis really matters to kind of show what kind of bang for your buck you're ending up getting with that investment.
Can I add another thought? And I'm actually curious what Steve thinks, what you'll think about this. I mean, I think the other, I've talked a lot about managing against risk and being clear about your risks. I think another challenge of trying to drive whole-scale systems change is fear. Well, at the same time, we want to be clear about what the risks are. We also can't allow the risk of failure to stop us from acting. And maybe another way of thinking about this is just not allowing the perfect to be the enemy of the good. There are so many different times within this process in the last 3 months where throughout city government there's been reluctance to do something differently because of the thing that could go wrong. And if you're going to make wholesale change, if you're going to have big implementation plans, you just have to be aware that things are going to go wrong. I mean, this could fail. It could not be successful. And so there is an element of courage that you need in leadership to be aware that failure is possible, failure in the large scale, but more likely failure in the margins is possible. And so I think that's also something to be vigilant against, is not to be so worried that you don't actually wind up being willing to make fundamental change or to take on big challenges.
No, I think Richard makes a great point, and I think there is that element, right? That perfect is the enemy of good. And to be honest, at Robinhood, we actually have that problem because sometimes we try to be perfect before even just being good. But I think how we mitigate against that is if we're going to take a risk, right? We want to make sure that as many ducks are lined up in a row as possible, right? And not every duck's going to be lined up. We want to make sure that as many as possible are lined up. Because sometimes you only have a couple of ducks lined up when you should have 4. But if you have at least 4, then that's good enough to take a risk. I'm using very bad analogies, but I'm hoping you sort of get it, right? But Richard's point is exactly right. Because I sometimes wish we took more risk. I really do. Because we are not good at that in many, many ways. And sometimes the perfect, we try to be perfect. And that's not good. But we try to mitigate that as much as possible. But Richard makes a great. I wish we had more courage sometimes.
And how do you get the decision makers to overcome their fear and take more risks?
I mean, I was in my case. I was hired by the risky decision makers, so I don't have that problem. But.
Yeah. No, and I say that sort of recognizing that we are in this moment when the decision maker has come in, sort of acknowledging that he is here to be courageous, take risks, and confront big problems. And so if every single person here feels like they are working directly for someone who is just like that, then we're in great shape. But if they're not, what does it take to drive that kind of change even within your own organization? Or to even just provoke that kind of change within your own organization? What ducks do you need to get lined up, and how many?
I'll take a stab, and this is very Robinhood unique, but a lot of what we try to do is math, right? It's math-based, right? And John mentioned return on investment. And so when you take risk and you don't really know what the outcomes are going to be, it's hard to do math, right? You can't do the algebra sometimes. You can't do the numerator on the algebra. That's very difficult. And so I think, what's going to take for us to overcome some of that math is for us to think better about what the math should be around risk. But that's a very unique Robin Hood thing, right? So it doesn't apply to many of you. But that's what I would have to overcome, right, to take more risk, is to figure out, what does it really mean from to some degree, a math perspective. Because every grant we do has to have some math.
I'll just share a personal little anecdote. So when I walk to work, I pass a church that puts a quote up on their little bulletin board thing that everyone's got with the glass. It's black, and you put the little white letters on it. And they had something. It's not a Catholic church, but they had something from Pope Francis up the other day, and I may not say it exactly, but it said, "Give me the freedom from the fear of change." And I thought that was very good. I might not have said exactly. So I think, we have to really point out to ourselves and to our leaders and to some of us are lucky enough to work for a leader that is very comfortable with that concept. But, I think that we really have to point out that what we want to change is worth it, and what we're going to be moving towards is so much more important than the fear of change. And so that's really where kind of what I'm thinking about when we think about changing workforce development, and certainly the mission I've been given by the mayor, who has these big important points about one city rising together is so much more important than any fear of change. And so we just personally, that's what I've been focused on right now.
I just imagine it's difficult to answer that question generically, only because every organization is different, and leaders will then be motivated by different kinds of information or argument. Presumably, people are in the room because their organizations are one who've embraced the importance of data, embraced the importance of impact, of being courageous. And so in some ways, my answer is to only work for organizations. I'm serious. To only work for organizations that take this work seriously enough, that take people seriously enough that they don't want to do this work unless they know they're having an impact. Work for a place which is passionate about actual change and impact. And if you do that, then you can probably navigate the rest of it. But if you're in the wrong organization, which does not have that culture, I would say find the organization that does.
It was really interesting. I'll also tell a personal story. Last year I had the privilege of participating in the American Express Leadership Academy. And during one of the sessions, it was really interesting because it was all focused on failure. And, many of us are so fearful of failure and are trained to not, to not want to, kind of move towards failure, and it can make us a little conservative. And the point that they were trying to make is that if you think back across your life, some of the best lessons you've learned have been through things that you've been unsuccessful at. They really are learning opportunities, and that's something that's really resonated with me since then. Now, how to convince leaders that that's the case, I can't answer that, but I do think that's true. I think all of us, if we were to think back across that, sometimes the best thing, you've learned so much from things that have been unsuccessful, but that you tried.
Great. Well, on that theme of overcoming fear and being courageous, I think it's a good transition to open up the floor for questions of our panelists. I think we'll wrap up in about 15, 20 minutes, but until then, our panelists have graciously agreed to talk to you about whatever you want to talk about. Yes, Anna.
It's really not a question, more like comments. With the minimum wage debate, and more recently, I can't remember what city it was that actually raised it.
Seattle,
okay, that's what I thought. So do you, being a municipality in New York City, it seems like the debate is it going to come from the federal level or is it going to be at the local level? So I want to get your thoughts on that. Where should it come from? But my second part is, what are your thoughts? Are there any unintended consequences to programs that we run under the SIF if the minimum wage does go up? Or maybe there's not consequences, I don't know. It's a good thing. I think it's a great thing. But considering the programs under SIF? Could there be?
Well, I can take my own advice here and not be afraid to answer that question, I guess. And I think it's a very challenging question. Certainly here in New York City, we have a living wage that we've been supporting, which is not at $15 an hour. But in the workforce development community, of which a lot of you are a part of, there's been a great paper out recently on from the Aspen Institute about raising the floor, building the ladder. And so I really think that, for me, there's this great momentum. Kate was asking a question about opportunities and policy opportunities. I do feel like there's a real momentum right now to start talking about raising the floor and really talking about how do we as organizations talk about entry-level work or subsidized work or transitional work and getting people started, but then how do they really create a family-supporting wage, which is something that the mayor is very clearly, our mayor is very clearly behind. So, before getting into too much of the answer, I think that the impact on a program would be positive, because it would be positive for families to have stronger income-supporting wages, and that's the way that our office is taking a look at quality jobs as one of our main pillars to take a look at with our Jobs for New Yorkers task force, and we are going to also be wrestling with these questions. But it's very clear that we must move forward with wages and jobs that support a family.
If you were sitting in a room with the Cato Institute, they would say something different, right? They would say something of the ilk that it would impact because some people aren't going to get jobs. Right, that's what they've been saying, right? So I have no idea if it's going to have impact. But if you take what some economists say, they're going to say half of 500,000 Americans aren't going to get a job, right? Because they raised a wage. If you raise a wage, so it depends on who you ask. I don't have an answer, but it depends.
Question in the back.
Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. One of the themes that's running through the whole day is the connection between innovation on the ground and scale at the big problems. And we heard from Angela, Rich missed it, she was very eloquent, that so much insight has to come from the wisdom of the people who are on the ground. And so you're in a room full of people who are doing the work on the ground. And I wonder just what advice you have in terms of scaling that you have for sort of frontline practitioners, not necessarily to replicate their own models, but to do what sort of Angela called for, which is to sort of lift up that which works, get it into the program models of system work or of the knowledge that NDRC is producing, or that kind of ways that things can grow. So advice for sort of frontline practitioners about how to lift up their voice.
Okay, I'll overcome my fear and take a crack at that. So there's an organization that I've been working with for a long time that's always impressed me because every person you talk to, from the CEO who you hope would be able to do this, but the folks that are that are employed by this organization that work outside, mowing the lawns, to managing the buildings, receptionists, everyone across the board knows exactly, can clearly articulate the mission of that organization and can speak very clearly about the difference that that organization makes. And I think it's because of the culture that the executive director has imbued throughout the organization around the importance that everyone needs to kind of basically be a marketer for the organization and understand what difference they make. And it's always struck me as really interesting that I've gone to this organization at random times. They don't necessarily know who I am. They're huge. And immediately folks are on there. They're asking questions. They're able to kind of articulate what it is they do, and it's this ownership across the board from the line staff all the way up about this is what we do, this is what we're about, and this is the difference that we make.
One of the things that I was very proud of in my time at the Children's Aid Society is that I think we were we are extremely innovative. I guess I have to say were, but we are extremely innovative. But the innovation was not necessarily around generating new ideas ourselves. I think we were very intentional about finding great ideas that we thought would matter to our families, and being very open-minded and about trying to understand those ideas and to see how they would impact our work. And I think about some of the programs that we launched around over the last few years, whether it was around college savings, conditional cash transfers, social emotional learning in schools, are not necessarily things that we invented, but it was because we were always open and hungry to ideas. And I think it was in part because we sort of created the space to allow folks to go out and find ideas and to bring them back to the organization. So, I mean, I guess just trying to be a learning organization and being very intentional about that, I think, was very important for us at the Children's Aid Society. And that's sort of one of the things that I would say, is you have to be really ravenous and inquisitive about what is happening around the world, which takes time and takes discipline. I think is really hard when you're just in the, just trying to get the work done. Because innovation is not always going to come from your head. I mean, what's the point of MDRC doing these studies if there aren't other providers around the country who are going to be trying to learn from those things and not necessarily replicate them, but learn from them and think about what implications they have for their own work.
So I'm a big basketball fan, and my favorite pro team is the San Antonio Spurs, right? And what's great about the Spurs is that they're actually a real team, right? I mean, they got some talent, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that everyone does their job brilliantly well. And this is organizational behavior 101, but just do your job brilliantly well, and things will take care of themselves for the most part, assuming you have some of the leadership that can drive some of the mission. But if you do your job brilliantly well, right, you will have 4 world titles, maybe 5 in a few weeks, right? So that's to me that's what it's about. You just do your job brilliantly well, strip away the egos, right, and things will mostly take care of themselves.
Okay. Other questions, Kelly?
Hi, thanks for being here. I'm really enjoying this panel. I want to pose an interesting question to you guys, building off of what John was saying from the American Express Leadership Institute. You guys have all had long careers. Can you give an example of a time that you tried to scale a program and it just failed completely? And, what did you learn for that so that we can anticipate as we're scaling our programs? Sorry to take it negative, but...
Wah, wah. Guess that means we're all really successful.
And I guess maybe to buffer that a little bit, one thing I think we've recognized in doing this work is that the road to scale is sometimes very, very long. So sometimes a program can be proven and then taken somewhere and you run into a barrier, or it just lies dormant for a while and then it can take off a decade later. So you may present a failure that is going to be the next big thing.
Okay. So,
Later.
We really wanted to take contextualized literacy to scale for our TANF clients when I was at HRA. And, it's not a failure, but definitely the implementation in the first year was a lot lower than I would have wanted. And I think that, it's also about taking on, we took on multiple new things in a new contract and, some new providers and new. So I think the lesson there is to take something to scale, to have it be implemented for the 70,000 people that are going to be involved with the program here in New York City. To have them all have access to contextualized literacy, I think, is successful. But the fact that it wasn't being able to be implemented as to really what contextualized literacy should be, to me was not successful. But again, that program's still there. It's a long road. I believe Kate is correct that we will get there. But I think it's acknowledging that maybe you're trying to do. For me, it was too much in the first year, and having to figure out how to bring something to scale that big, I think, and that important, and having to build the time to do it.
I don't know that I have examples of programs that I've involved that tried to scale that didn't work. I have plenty of examples of programs that I've tried to develop that didn't work. But but then we didn't try to bring them to scale.
Smart.
So I got lots of those. I have lots of those. I mean, I guess the closest example I would give is, an organization I was involved, I helped lead along with Matt actually, called Groundwork, where I think what I would say that we did not build the organizational infrastructure that we needed to be successful as an organization, which is different than having a program that we tried to scale that was not effective. So that's a different topic, but that's sort of the closest I have.
I have sort of an example, but a totally different universe. I used to work in Silicon Valley. I started a software company. And I had a gut instinct on how we could succeed. In essence, I thought we could get into retail. And so I started asking for money to help start this thing. And the people who gave us money said, Steve, you're an idiot. Don't get into retail. And so what I did is I listened to the idiots who gave me money to not go into retail. And it was, for the first year, it was an abysmal failure until we started going into retail. So the lesson for me is, right, sometimes we chase the money, right? And you get lots of money, but then you're beholden to the people who give you money. And that's just the way that's the world we live in, right? And I didn't trust my gut instinct, right? And it just, to some degree, my ego was bad. It didn't work out. And I don't know if there's a lesson, because you got to get the money, right? But maybe the lesson is trust your gut. Maybe the lesson is, I don't know, don't be an egotistical ass like I was, right? I don't know what it was, but to me, it's like when you have money, right? It sometimes takes you in different ways you don't want to go.
It's really interesting. That the example that I was thinking of was a program we were working with that was a boutique program. It served maybe 25, 30 kids a year, really compelling model. We had some federal funding to really scale it up. Basically, we wanted to grow it to serve about 500 kids a year, so to be part of the study and show that this particular model could really make a difference. And boy, was that challenging. And what was challenging about it, what kind of surprised me, some of the things that really impeded us were things that made the program so great. So for example, the supervisor that oversaw the staff was terrific. She really knew her stuff. She knew exactly what all the staff were doing. But suddenly when you're supervising 50 people and you don't know everyone in your caseload and you don't know, exactly what every one of your staff was doing, that was really hard for her to make that shift from managing staff in a small program to being 2 steps removed from the participants that were actually part of the program. So it was those kinds of unanticipated challenges that I think really led us to have to kind of go in and really help the executive director of the program kind of rethink what it means to scale effectively, and how to set up a organizational structure that would really kind of support that rollout.
I think we have time for one more question. Lourdes, yes?
So I have a question. I was just thinking about, the great work that's taking place here in New York under the new mayor, and how the conversation and maybe the involvement of people have really sort of led to identifying universal pre-K as a priority. So I was just wondering sort of what recommendations or suggestions would you have for cities that are, I'd say San Antonio has been doing a very good job, but there's challenges with getting sort of ordinary folks to see the benefits of some of the initiatives, some of the programs, some of the efforts that are underway, and really to see why this work, whether it's the work of building equity or addressing poverty, why it's important. So, so I guess, Richard, for you, what is it about the New York strategy that is working, and how do you ensure that people are part of this process?
Well, it may be fundamentally because Bill de Blasio is at his heart an organizer and a campaign manager. So it is not a top-down approach. So even the campaign to secure this historic money from Albany to expand the universal pre-kindergarten was not fundamentally about Mayor de Blasio and Governor Cuomo sitting in a room negotiating. It was really about a grassroots, with essentially a political campaign that created the pressure to ensure that we got the $300 million a year that we needed for this initiative. So I guess what I would say is that the idea of getting grassroots support for these bold changes is not an afterthought in the way that we think about things. It happens before the work even happens, and even the way we approach how do you communicate to families what universal pre-K is and how do you enroll. I mean, the person who I hired to lead that work is a campaign manager. His career is spent running political campaigns, and so we approach it like a campaign. And so there's nothing that we do that's big that's not about a grassroots strategy for engagement and implementation. And again, I think that really starts from the top, because it's not my background, it's his. And so it's really driven by how he sees the world, and that drives how we see the world.
All right. No more questions? Okay, then I think we'll wrap it up there. Please join me in thanking our panelists.